Fly home, don't say a word to mom or your brother. That warning lit up my phone at 6:47 a.m. At that exact moment, I was standing on a balcony at a Hilton Head resort, watching my mother laugh for the first time in 21 years because of some joke my brother made. Just a strange number, no name, and a short message that made my military instincts turn ice cold. 12 hours later, the South Carolina heat was gone, and I was standing in the arrivals hall at Hartford Bradley Airport. A man in a charcoal suit stood there holding a sign with my name on it. He wasn't alone. Two state troopers were standing right next to him. What they showed me in that quiet conference room that day. Look, I'm a soldier. I've stared down life and death on the front lines without so much as a blink. But in that room, I don't even remember hitting the floor. I just remember waking up under those blinding fluorescent lights, listening to a medic tell me to count backward from 10 just to check if I was still there. That happened 4 months ago. I still haven't had a full night's sleep since, but I need to tell you the whole story. Because of what my own flesh and blood did and the way I chose to hit back, the person I used to be was burned away forever. Before I go on, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you've ever felt the sting of a family's betrayal. And I really want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your city and your local time in the comments. My name is Captain Juliet Beard. I'm 32 years old. This is the story of how my mother and brother planned to wreck my life, and how the truth ended up being the only thing that saved it. Now, let me take you back to a rain-soaked November night in Connecticut. The night they stripped me of my rank as a daughter. I was only 11 years old. Tuesday, November 14th, 2003. I remember the date because the air in Connecticut had that sharp metallic bite that usually precedes a heavy snow. Instead, it just rained. I pushed the front door open, my small hands fumbling with the deadbolt. Inside my jacket pocket was a folded piece of paper, a museum permission slip for the 5th grade field trip. It was a small thing. All I needed was a signature and $3. $3. That was the price of my world back then. Margaret was standing at the kitchen island, the cold light reflecting off the gray granite. She didn't look up when I came in. She never did. The phone was pressed to her ear, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the stone. Her voice was flat, devoid of any inflection, like a recorded weather report that didn't care if the storm killed you. "It's done," she said into the receiver. "She's leaving tonight." She set the handset down on the granite with a dry, hollow click. I stood there, holding that permission slip so tight the edges dug into my palm. I was waiting for something. A nod, a scold for being late. Anything that proved I was a person and not just background noise. But Margaret's eyes just slid over me, the same way they'd look at a piece of furniture that didn't fit the room anymore. "Get your things together." The order was issued without a glance. Dean, my older brother, stepped out from the living room. He was 14, already tall enough to lean against the wall with that smug, predatory slouch he'd perfected. He crossed his arms, a small, ugly smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't ask why. He didn't try to stop her. He just watched, enjoying the show. Margaret reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy-duty black leaf bag, the kind people use for yard waste. She shoved it into my chest. No suitcase, no, "I'm sorry," just the rustle of cheap plastic. I went to my room and shoved a few shirts and a pair of jeans into the bottom of that bag. My hands weren't shaking yet. I was in shock, moving like a ghost through my own life. When I walked back to the front door, the wind hit me first, cold, wet, and relentless. Margaret stood on the porch, pointing a single finger toward the darkness of the driveway. She didn't look at my face. She just looked past me. "Go. Don't come back." The door slammed. I heard the lock turn, a heavy final thud. Just like that, the air was cut off. I began the first march of my life that night. The rain in Connecticut doesn't just fall, it soaks through your skin and settles in your bones. It hammered against the black leaf bag, making a dry, rhythmic popping sound that felt like it was echoing inside my skull. My canvas sneakers were waterlogged within 10 minutes. Every step felt like I was dragging weights through the mud. Hubbard Street was 3 miles away. 3 miles of pitch-black road, illuminated only by the occasional sweep of headlights from cars that splashed dirty water onto my shins as they flew past. I didn't cry. Maybe I couldn't. Or maybe the rain was just doing the job for me. I gripped the top of that trash bag until my knuckles turned white, staring at the ground, putting one foot in front of the other. That was my first real survival lesson. No one is coming to save you. If you want to get somewhere, you walk until your feet bleed. It was 9:20 p.m. when I finally collapsed onto the porch of the small Cape Cod house on Hubbard. My legs gave out. I sat there, shivering, clutching that wet bag of rags like it was a treasure. The porch light flickered on, cutting through the dark. The door opened. Walter Ashford stood there. He was a man who lived in grease-stained flannels, a retired mechanic who spoke more with his hands than his mouth. He stopped dead when he saw me. A dripping 11-year-old mess huddled at his feet. He didn't pick up the phone to scream at Margaret. He didn't ask a single question. He just dropped to one knee on the hardwood, letting the freezing rain from my clothes soak into his shirt. He didn't care about the floor. He didn't care about the mess. He pulled me into an embrace that smelled of engine oil, Old Spice, and safety. He held me so tight I could hear his heart beat through the heavy fabric of his coat. "You're home now, my little bird." His voice was a low rumble against the top of my head. It was the last warm hug I would receive from anyone sharing my blood for the next 21 years. I didn't know it then, but Walter had already begun building the legal fortress that would eventually save me. I was safe. But as I looked back at the dark road, I knew the girl who had walked those 3 miles was gone. The daughter was dead. The soldier was just beginning to wake up. Walter's house was my tactical repair station. For 7 years, the silence from the house on the other side of town was absolute. Margaret didn't call. Dean didn't send a card. They wiped me out of their lives like a grease stain on a laminate counter. Just a quick scrub, and I was gone. Saturday afternoons, I'd sit on a milk crate in the corner of Grandpa's garage. I watched him tear down lawnmower engines, his hands covered in black sludge and grit. The air was always thick with degreaser and the scent of old cigars. I remember asking him once, while he was deep into a carburetor, why they never came for me. Grandpa stopped. He laid his half-inch wrench on the steel workbench with a heavy clink that echoed against the cinder block walls. He looked at me with the steady gaze of an old soldier. "One day, Juliet, you'll see why I kept you here. Why I kept you far from them," he said. His voice was a low growl, like a truck idling in the cold. He didn't explain. He just went back to the engine. When I turned 18, 3 weeks before I was set to ship out for the academy, Grandpa died in his sleep. No drama. Just an empty seat at the breakfast table and a house that suddenly felt way too big. The funeral was a small gray affair at a suburban church that smelled of old hymnals and damp coats. After 7 years of nothing, Margaret showed up. She was draped in black silk, a heavy silver cross dangling from her neck. She looked like a professional mourner. She'd dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, but her eyes were bone dry. I watched her from the back row, standing straight, hands behind my back. I was wearing a borrowed black dress that didn't fit, but it was dark enough to hide I was hollowed out. For 2 hours, she played the part of the grieving daughter for the neighbors. She walked past me 4 times. Each time, the click of her heels on the floorboard sounded like a countdown. She looked through me like I was made of glass. No nod, no touch. I watched the performance with a cold disgust. The crowd thinned out. I walked to the front, standing alone before the pine casket. I reached out and touched the polished wood. It felt like the last solid thing in my world was about to be buried. Footsteps heavy on the floor behind me, leather creaking. I knew the smell before I heard the voice, cowhide and stale Marlboro Reds. Dean. He leaned in, pretending to share a moment of grief with his little sister. But when his mouth got close, his voice came out like a jagged blade rattling through his teeth. "Don't expect a dime, you brat. Grandpa left everything to Mom. House, accounts, the works. There is nothing here for you, not a cent." He slapped my shoulder twice, a claim of territory, not comfort. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing in the empty church. He wanted to see me break. I didn't move. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a flinch. Military discipline doesn't let you fall apart when the enemy is in the wire. When Dean left, an older man stepped from the back row. Thomas Mercer. He was a lawyer, a guy I'd seen having tea with Grandpa. He looked like he'd been carved out of granite. He didn't say much. He pressed an envelope into my hand. Cream-colored, heavy paper, sealed with thick red wax. On top was a gold-embossed business card. "It isn't time to open this yet, Juliet," he whispered. His eyes were hard, but there was a flicker of something else in there. Respect. I nodded twice. I shoved the envelope into my coat, feeling the sharp edge of the card against my thumb. That afternoon, I tossed my duffel bag into the luggage bay of a Greyhound bus. I sat by the window and watched the Connecticut state line disappear in the rearview mirror. I was 18, alone, heading into a life where nobody knew my name. I didn't know then that the envelope in my pocket was a shield. I didn't know that the card would save my life 14 years later. I'm telling you this because I know some of you have been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to love you. You've stood in a room full of family and felt like a ghost. If you've ever had to walk away from a toxic house to find your own peace, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps me know I'm not just talking to the wind. And do me a favor, drop the word shield in the comments if you've ever had someone like Walter or Thomas stand up for you when you couldn't stand for yourself. I read every single one of them. The bus rattled over a pothole, jarring my teeth. I touched the cream-colored envelope through the fabric of my coat. I didn't open it. I just sat there in the dark, watching the highway lights flash past, wondering if I'd ever truly have a home again. I thought I was leaving the war behind forever. I was wrong. The real fight hadn't even started yet. Military school doesn't teach you how to love. It teaches you how to not end up in a body bag. I lived that lesson for a decade, etched into my skin by the grit of places God forgot. From the sand-blasted hellholes of the Middle East, where the air smells like burning trash and diesel, to the frozen gray bases in Europe, I never looked for a home. I looked for cover. Every dime of hazard pay I earned, the blood money they pay you when you're officially worth more dead than alive, went straight into the market. I knew that every bullet snapping past my ear had a price tag. I wasn't spending my paychecks on sports cars or bad decisions in Vegas like the other recruits. I was building a fortress. Somewhere along the way, an anonymous trust fund kept the tuition for my advanced degrees paid up. I never asked where the money came from. I just kept my head down and worked. I wasn't buying luxury. I was buying a perimeter. I turned that perimeter into Hearthline. I took everything I knew about military logistics and shoved it into a tech platform designed to connect orphans with veteran mentors. It wasn't about finding yourself. It was about structure, resilience, accountability. By 30, some venture capital sharks in Silicon Valley took one look at my balance sheets and my discipline and cut a check. They valued the company at $47 million. On paper, the girl who got kicked out with a trash bag was now a millionaire. I had an empire. I had a name. And for 14 years, I didn't have a family. I was fine with that, until I wasn't. Then came the call. 9:14 p.m., Saturday night. The area code on the screen was Connecticut. I shouldn't have picked it up. My gut knew it was a breach. But the discipline slipped for a split second. "Juliet, it's Mom." Margaret's voice didn't sound like the ice-cold weather report I remembered from the kitchen island. It was shaking, thin, pathetic. She didn't lead with a demand. She led with cancer. "Early stage," she said. "Terminal if it wasn't handled." In 2 minutes, she managed to say, "I'm sorry," 4 times. For Margaret, that was a world record. She begged me to come to Hilton Head for a final family vacation. She wanted to fix the past before the clock ran out. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a tactical vest that was 3 sizes too small. The captain in me was screaming, "Ambush!" The 11-year-old girl who still remembered the smell of the rain on Hubbard Street was reaching for the phone. "Classic feint, Juliet." Grace didn't hold back. She was a former combat medic who'd stitched me up more than once. She slammed her coffee mug onto the table, the ceramic ringing like a gunshot. They didn't remember they had a daughter for 14 years. Now you're worth 47 mil and suddenly she's got a cough and a conscience? Don't go. Grace was right. I knew she was right. But guilt is a funny thing. It's the one wound that military training can't cauterize. I booked the ticket. But I didn't go in blind. I flew private. I booked a suite at a hotel 2 blocks away from where they were staying. I mapped out every exit. I set up an exfil route. If this was a trap, I wasn't going to be the one caught in the cage. I was going to be the one holding the key. The night before I left, a text buzzed from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no context. Just 2 words. Be careful. I stared at it for a long time. I assumed it was some spam bot or a wrong number. I swiped left and deleted it. I had survived IEDs and snipers in the belly of the beast. I figured I could handle a sick old woman and a gambling addict brother. I was wrong. That was my first intelligence failure. I touched down at Hilton Head, the humid South Carolina air sticking to my skin like a wet shroud. As I walked off the tarmac, the phone buzzed again. Same number, different message. They aren't looking at your face, Juliet. They're looking at the bank account. I shoved the phone into my pocket and tightened my grip on my bag. The war was coming home. And I had just walked right into the kill zone. I checked the time. 10:02 a.m. I had 3 hours before the family dinner. 3 hours to decide if I was the guest of honor or the sacrifice. I walked toward the rental car, my back straight, my eyes scanning the perimeter. In the distance, I could hear the ocean. It sounded like the static on a dead radio. I wasn't here for a vacation. I was here for a debriefing. And if Margaret wanted to play the cancer card, I was going to make sure I saw her medical records before I saw her tears. I didn't get to 47 million by being soft. I got there by being the one who didn't blink. I pulled out of the airport, the green numbers of my bank balance flashing in my mind like HUD. 47 million reasons for them to lie. 1 reason for me to stay. I needed to know if any part of that apology was real. The first text was a warning. The second was a confirmation. By the time I reached the hotel, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a family reunion. It was an extraction, and I was the asset. Hilton Head Island looked like a postcard, but to me, it felt like a kill zone. The South Carolina sun was aggressive, baking the salt into the air and making the palm trees look like jagged teeth against the blue. Margaret was waiting on the patio in a motorized wheelchair. She had a designer silk scarf wrapped tight around her head, playing the role of the frail, terminal mother to absolute perfection. Dean sat next to her, looking bloated in a polo shirt that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Beside him was Amber, his latest girlfriend, a woman with sharp, hungry eyes that spent the whole afternoon inventorying the price of my watch and the cut of my boots. Margaret made sure her voice carried to the neighboring tables in the resort lobby. "My daughter is finally home after all these years," she'd say, loud enough for the tourists to hear, her voice cracking just enough to sell the lie. She was building the narrative, setting the stage so that if things went south, I'd be the cold-hearted runaway and she'd be the saintly victim. I didn't correct her. I just sat there, spine straight as rebar, hands resting flat on the tablecloth. I watched Dean's eyes. They weren't looking at a sister they'd missed. They were calculating the ROI on a $47 million asset. Dinner was a slow-motion interrogation. The smell of burnt shrimp from the resort grill hung heavy in the humid air, mixing with the soulless, rhythmic thud of the Atlantic waves hitting the shore. Dean waited until the wine was halfway gone before he started probing for mines. He leaned back, swirled his glass, and let a sentence drop like a lead weight. "You know Grandpa left everything to Mom, right? The house, the savings, all of it." I kept my face like stone and gave him a shallow nod. I didn't bite. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out under the table. It was the same unknown number from the night before. "Has your brother asked about the money yet?" I took a screenshot and shoved it back into my pocket. By 11 p.m., I was done with the theater. I stepped out onto the darkened balcony of my room, but the air was too thick to breathe. I walked down the back hallway toward the vending machines, keeping my footsteps light. As I passed Dean's suite, I heard Margaret's voice through the thin wood of the door. It wasn't the voice of a dying woman anymore. It was sharp, cold, and dripping with venom. "She doesn't know a thing. Just keep pushing," she snapped. "I think she's suspicious, Ma," Dean muttered back. "Then act better," Margaret hissed. "We need her signature, and we need it now." I stood in the shadows of the hallway for a long time, my heart rate steady despite the bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a family vacation. This was a heist. On the third morning, Dean decided to pull the trigger. He didn't wait for the coffee to get cold. He slid a thick stack of papers across the wooden breakfast table. The sound of the paper screeching against the wood was like a knife on a plate. "Mom's getting weak, and I'm swamped with the house stuff," Dean said, trying to sound like a burdened son. "It's just a standard power of attorney for the family assets. Sign it so we can keep things moving without bothering you every 5 minutes." I didn't reach for a pen. I flipped through the pages. It wasn't standard. It was a total handover. It gave them full access to my bank accounts, my real estate, my life. Signing that page meant handing over the keys to the $47 million fortress I'd spent 10 years building in the mud and the sand. I folded the document and looked Dean straight in the eyes. "I need to read this carefully," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. Dean's face turned a mottled red. He slammed his fork down on the porcelain plate, the sound echoing through the quiet patio. "Don't you trust your own family, Juliet?" I didn't answer. I just stood up and walked away. Back in my room, I took high-res photos of every single page and sent them to a JAG officer I'd served with in Europe. 10 minutes later, the reply came back in one line. "Do not sign. This gives him total control over everything you own." Almost instantly, a third text from the unknown number lit up my screen. "Fly home. Do not say a word to them. Go now." The sender claimed to be someone my grandfather trusted. I had two choices: stay and fight people who shared my DNA, or listen to a stranger. I chose survival. At 4:30 a.m., while the resort was still dead silent and the only sound was the indifferent hiss of the tide, I packed my gear. I didn't use the elevator. I took the back stairs, my duffel bag over my shoulder, moving like a ghost through the service exits. I didn't check out at the front desk. I just walked to the curb and caught an Uber to the airport in the pre-dawn gray. As the plane's engines roared and the wheels left the tarmac, I took one last look at the South Carolina coastline. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was vibrating with back-to-back calls from Dean. I didn't answer. I didn't send a text. I just held the power button until the screen went black. The vacation was over. The war had officially moved into the tactical phase. The wheels of the jet barked against the runway at Hartford Bradley International Airport, a sharp, violent jolt that mirrored the state of my nerves. Outside the window, Connecticut was awash of depressing gray, the kind of sky that looked like a bruised lung. I stepped off the plane, my boots striking the terminal floor with a heavy, rhythmic cadence. I didn't have to look far. Standing near the baggage claim was Thomas Mercer, the man who had handed me a lifeline 14 years ago. He wasn't alone. 2 state troopers stood beside him, their faces as hard as the badges on their chests. They didn't say a word. Thomas gave me a grim nod, and we moved through the terminal like a funeral procession. We ended up in a back-office conference room, a sterile, windowless box tucked away at the end of a maintenance hall. The air in the room was stale, smelling of industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. Above us, the fluorescent lights flickered with a high-pitched, irritating hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. Rachel Dunn was already there. She was a private investigator, a woman who looked like she'd spent half her life in the shadows. She didn't offer a handshake. She just opened a manila folder. "Your grandfather," Thomas said, his voice slow and heavy. "He was smarter than they gave him credit for. He never left a cent to your mother. Not a dime. He left $2.8 million in a trust for you, Juliet. And Dean. Dean's in deep. He owes some very bad people $340,000 in gambling debts. They found a draft of that will. they knew they were cut out. Rachel pushed a stack of glossy surveillance photos and printed transcripts across the table. The paper crinkled, a dry, abrasive sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. "They didn't just want your signature on that power of attorney, Juliet," Rachel said, her eyes locked on mine. "They didn't need you to sign it. They just needed you to vanish." She explained the logistics with the cold detachment of an actuary. The power of attorney was Plan A. If I signed, they'd drain the accounts and be done with it. But Dean had a Plan B. He'd hired a guy named Victor, a low-rent enforcer who'd been shadowing me since I stepped onto the sand at Hilton Head. Rachel pointed to a printout of a text message Victor had sent to Dean. "Make it look like an accident. Balcony. Pool. Somewhere clean," it read. The room felt like it was shrinking. Amber, the girl Dean was parading around, was the spotter. She had been reporting my room number and my schedule to the man who was waiting to push me over a railing. I sat perfectly still, my back against the hard plastic chair. I'd faced IEDs, I'd faced snipers, I'd faced the kind of enemies who looked you in the eye before they pulled the trigger. But this was coming from inside the house. "There's more," Rachel said, her voice dropping an octave. She flipped to the last page of the file. It was a text message thread from Dean to Margaret, sent 20 minutes after I'd walked away from the breakfast table at the resort. Dean had told her I wouldn't sign. He'd told her I was suspicious. He'd asked her if they should go through with the rest of the plan. I looked at the screen, at the words my mother had typed back. "Just do it. Leave me out of it." 8 words. 8 words that sold my life for the sake of her own plausible deniability. 8 words from the woman who had brought me into this world, now giving the green light to take me out of it. I stared at the black ink on the white paper until the edges started to blur. The fluorescent light above me strobed, a frantic, jagged rhythm. I didn't feel my legs go out. I didn't feel the edge of the table as I went down. The world just folded in on itself, turning into a silent, suffocating black. When I opened my eyes, the white lights were blinding. I was flat on the scuffed linoleum floor. A paramedic was leaning over me, a small flashlight burning into my pupils. "Count backward from 10 for me, Captain," he said, his voice sounding like it was underwater. I didn't count. I pushed his hand away and sat up, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I could taste something metallic and bitter. Blood. I'd bitten my lip through. A coldness, deeper and more permanent than anything I'd felt in the mountains of Afghanistan, started at the base of my skull and moved down my spine. It froze the grief. It froze the shock. It left nothing but a sharp, jagged edge of clarity. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Those were questions for a girl who still had a mother. I stood up, leaning against the wall for a second until my balance returned. I looked at Thomas Mercer. His face was a mask of professional concern, but I didn't need his pity. I needed his ruthlessness. "I don't want revenge," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was dry and flat, like metal scraping against stone. "I want them to lose everything. I want them to wake up in a world where they don't have a cent, a friend, or a roof over their heads. I want them to lose it all. Start it." Thomas didn't blink. He just nodded and reached for his phone. Rachel Dunn closed the folder with a definitive snap. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed through the gray Connecticut afternoon. The daughter in me was officially dead. The soldier was back on the clock. And this time, I wasn't fighting for a flag. I was fighting for the only thing I had left. The truth. I walked toward the door, my footsteps steady now. Every second of my life before this moment had just been training. The war didn't start in the desert. It started right here, under the hum of a flickering light in a room that smelled like bleach. "Let's go," I said. We stepped out of the room, leaving the 8 words on the table. The countdown had finally hit 0. The counter-strike didn't start with a bang. It started with a click. The click of a pair of heavy-duty Smith & Wesson cuffs. Victor was snatched in the Hilton Head parking lot at 2 a.m. while he was crouched near the rear axle of my rental car, checking the lines. By 7 a.m., the South Carolina state troopers didn't knock on the door of the presidential suite. They used a ram. While Dean was being pressed face down into the plush beige carpet, Margaret was in the room next door, screeching at the top of her lungs. She wasn't screaming for her son. She was screaming for a lawyer, her voice cutting through the humid morning air like a jagged piece of glass. I wasn't there to see it. I was 800 miles away, sitting in Thomas Mercer's office in Connecticut. The room was silent, save for the hum of a desktop computer and the faint sound of traffic on the street below. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. The caller ID flashed. Mother. I didn't hesitate. I swiped the screen and hit the speakerphone. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Juliet, what the hell did you do? Margaret's voice rumbled through the speaker, distorted by rage. She wasn't dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief anymore. She was spitting venom. You want to kill your own brother? You want to see him rot in a cell over a misunderstanding? I leaned back in the leather chair, my spine hitting the backrest with practiced precision. I picked up a glass of water, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He hired a man to push me off a balcony, Margaret, I said. My voice was flat, the tone I used when debriefing a squad after a failed op. Dean was just scared. He's in debt, Juliet. He's panicked. You're a soldier. You're supposed to be tough. Why are you being so damn heartless? Calling the cops on your own blood? Over a little scare? I looked at Thomas. He was watching me, his eyes hooded. I reached into the file on the desk and pulled out the transcript Rachel Dunn had handed me at the airport. I cleared my throat and read the words back to the woman who had carried me for 9 months. Dean, should we go through with the rest of the plan? Margaret, just do it. Leave me out of it. The line went dead quiet. I could hear her breathing, a ragged, desperate sound on the other end of the connection. The gaslighting was over. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered into 1,000 pieces. I didn't wait for her to find another lie. I tapped the red button and watched the screen go dark. Margaret didn't go down without a fight. She was back in Connecticut within 48 hours, out on a bond that probably drained the last of her liquid cash. She didn't come to my door. She went to the one place where she knew she could do the most damage, the First Baptist Church. By Sunday morning, the rumor mill was churning at full capacity. Margaret stood in the vestibule, clutching her silver cross, telling anyone who would listen that I was suffering from a severe military break. She used the word PTSD like a weapon. She told the deacons I was paranoid, that the war had broken my brain, and that I was framing poor Dean to steal the family inheritance. She even filed a petition to void Grandpa Walter's will, claiming he'd been senile when he signed it. She was trying to bury me under a mountain of social shame. She wanted the neighbors to cross the street when they saw me. She wanted the town to see me as a dangerous, delusional veteran who had turned on her own mother. But Margaret made one fatal mistake. She assumed people like her. She assumed her neighbors had forgotten the way she looked down her nose at them for 30 years. My burner phone rang on Tuesday afternoon. It was Mrs. Boyd, the woman who lived in the house behind Grandpa's. She'd known me since I was a kid in pigtails. Juliet, she whispered, her voice crackling with age. Don't listen to that woman. We know who she is, and we know what Walter kept in that garage. That afternoon, I met Thomas Mercer at his office. He wasn't holding a legal brief this time. He was holding a heavy, scarred box made of solid oak. It had a brass padlock that looked older than I was. Your grandfather gave me strict instructions, Thomas said. He slid a rusted iron key across the desk. It made a sharp, metallic sound against the wood. He said to give this to you only when the legal war officially began. He knew this day was coming, Juliet. He knew them better than you did. I took the key. My hands weren't shaking, but I could feel the weight of the moment in my chest. I fit the key into the lock and turned it. Clack. I lifted the lid. The smell of cedar and old yellowed paper drifted up. I expected money. I expected a hidden deed. Instead, I found 7 black composition notebooks, their edges frayed and stained with grease. Tucked between the pages were psychiatric reports from the late 90s, recorded phone logs, and stacks of Western Union receipts. Commander Walter Ashford hadn't just been a mechanic. He had been a silent observer. For 17 years, while I was off fighting wars in the desert, he had been conducting his own intelligence operation right here in Connecticut. He had documented every cent Margaret stole, every lie she told the state, and every time she had tried to have him declared incompetent to get his house. I picked up the first notebook. The first entry was dated July 2003, the month before they kicked me out. I realized then that I hadn't been alone. Walter had spent his final years building a dossier that wasn't just evidence, it was a firing squad. "Thomas," I said, my fingers tracing the jagged handwriting of a man who had loved me enough to go to war with his own daughter. "Yeah, Juliet." "Call the prosecutor. We're moving up the timeline." I closed the box. I could hear the rain starting to hit the window pane, the same rhythmic tapping from that night on Hubbard Street. But I wasn't the girl in the rain anymore. I was the storm. The journals were a roadmap of every sin Margaret Beard had ever committed. And I was going to read every single one of them into the public record. I gripped the edge of the oak box. It felt solid. It felt like justice. "Let's burn it all down," I whispered. Thomas nodded. He reached for the phone. The countdown to the trial had officially begun. December in Connecticut doesn't play around. The air outside the probate court was a sheet of ice, and the wind felt like a serrated blade against my neck. Inside, the courtroom smelled of lemon polish, old paper, and the damp, heavy scent of wet wool coats. Margaret was already there, anchored in the front row on the left. She wasn't alone. She'd brought her Amen corner, half a dozen women from the First Baptist Church, all clutching their Bibles and casting side-eyed glares at me. They looked like they were waiting for an exorcism. Margaret's lawyer, a guy named Holloway, who smelled like sour coffee and cheap peppermint, started his opening. He painted a picture of a frail, confused Walter Ashford. He used words like senile and diminished capacity. He pointed at me, the rogue soldier, the granddaughter who stayed away for 14 years, only to swoop in when the smell of money hit the air. I sat there, hands folded on the oak table, spine as straight as a bayonet. I didn't look at him. I watched the judge's gavel. Thomas Mercer didn't even bother to stand up until Holloway was finished preening. When he finally did, he didn't give a speech. He just started firing. Bullet number 1. Thomas slid a blue folder onto the judge's desk. "Dr. Sterling's independent psychiatric evaluation," Thomas said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Conducted exactly 2 weeks before the final will was signed. The doctor's conclusion? Walter Ashford was as sharp as a razor. He wasn't confused. He was disgusted." I saw Holloway's jaw tighten. Margaret's church ladies stopped whispering. Thomas didn't stop. Bullet number 2. He pulled one of the black composition notebooks from the oak box. He opened it to a page marked with a grease-stained tab. He read the entry from November 2003 out loud. Walter's jagged blue-collar handwriting projected on the big screen behind the bench. "Margaret kicked the girl out tonight, in the rain, like she was yesterday's trash. I have the slip. I have the girl. I'll never forgive my daughter for this." Holloway jumped up. "Objection! Hearsay! A dead man's diary isn't evidence." Thomas didn't even flinch. He just looked toward the back of the room. "The defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Boyd to the stand." That was the grenade. Mrs. Boyd was 82 years old and weighed maybe 90 pounds, but when she walked to that witness stand, she looked like a giant. She adjusted her glasses, took the oath, and looked Margaret dead in the eye. "I saw it," Mrs. Boyd said, her voice crackling like dry leaves but holding firm. "I was in my kitchen, looking out the window. It was raining buckets. I saw Margaret shove that child onto the porch. I saw the black trash bag. Margaret told the police later that Juliet ran away. That was a lie. She discarded that girl like a piece of broken furniture." The courtroom went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the heater and the frantic scratching of the court reporter's pen. The Amen corner started looking at their shoes. Margaret made a small strangled sound in the back of her throat, like a trapped animal. The judge slammed his gavel. "The will is valid. proceed to the matter of the restraining order and the criminal referral. Thomas didn't waste a second. He hit the switch on the projector. My bank records from the tech company flashed up first. 47 million reasons to kill. Then the surveillance photos from Hilton Head. The hitman, Victor, caught on camera near the hotel pool. And finally, the text message thread. The room held its breath as the words appeared in giant black letters against the white screen. Dean, should we go through with the rest of the plan? Margaret, just do it. Leave me out of it. One of the deacons from the church stood up and walked out of the room without looking back. Margaret's face went the color of curdled milk. The mask was gone. The saint was dead. The judge didn't even wait for a rebuttal. Restraining order granted. Protective custody for the assets remains in effect. I am referring these transcripts to the district attorney's office for immediate review of conspiracy to commit murder. Crack! The gavel hit the block like a gunshot. During the 15-minute recess, I walked out into the hallway to get some air. Margaret caught me by the vending machines. Her mascara was running, making black streaks down her face that looked like cracks in a porcelain doll. She reached out, her fingers feeling like cold, wet claws as she grabbed my wrist. "Juliet, please," she hissed, her voice a mess of fake tears and desperation. "Withdraw the statement. You're killing your mother. Your own blood." I didn't pull away. I didn't scream. I just used a basic military wrist lock, a quick, sharp twist of the radius and ulna. It wasn't enough to break bone, but it was enough to send a bolt of white-hot pain up her arm. She let out a sharp yelp, and her hand dropped as if she'd touched a hot stove. I stepped into her space, my eyes locking onto hers. I didn't see a mother. I saw an insurgent. "Don't ever touch me again," I said, my voice as cold as the December wind. "I've faced snipers in the desert and IEDs in the mud. I thought they were the enemy. I was wrong. You're scarier than any of them because you do it with a smile and a Bible. The truth is out now, Margaret, and I'm not the one who's dying. You are." I turned my back on her and walked away. I didn't look back to see her fall. I just focused on the exit sign at the end of the hall. I'm sharing this part of my life because I know there are people listening right now who are terrified of standing up to their own monsters in the family. You think they're too powerful, or that nobody will believe you. But the truth has a weight that no lie can carry forever. If you've ever found the strength to speak up when everyone else stayed silent, please hit that like button and subscribe to this journey. It means more than you know. And do me a favor. If you believe that truth eventually wins, comment the word justice below. I want to see how many of us are standing together. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse. The cold air hit me, but it didn't feel like a blade anymore. It felt clean. It felt like the first breath of air after being buried alive. Behind me, I could hear Holloway shouting into his phone. It didn't matter. The fortress was built. The war was won. But as I reached my car, I saw Thomas Mercer standing by the bumper, holding a single cream-colored envelope. The wax seal was still intact. "There's one more thing Walter wanted you to see," he said. I looked at the envelope. My name was on it, in my grandmother's handwriting. My heart, which had been a block of ice all day, skipped a beat. The battle in the courtroom was over, but the hardest truth was still waiting for me inside that paper. March arrived with the finality of a slamming steel door. Dean stood in the well of the courtroom at the McDougal Walker Correctional Institution, looking small and deflated. The fluorescent lights were unforgiving, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. There was no room for lies. The digital trail Rachel Dunn had unearthed was an interstate highway leading straight to a cell. When the judge read the sentence, 8 years, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a cold weight in my gut. I sat in the front row, back straight, breathing controlled. I watched the bailiff lead him away, the clink of leg irons the only music in the room. I visited him 2 days later. One last time. I sat behind a plexiglass partition that smelled of industrial soap. Dean sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit 3 sizes too big. He didn't look at my face. He didn't say he was sorry. He leaned forward, knuckles rapping the laminate table. I just needed the money, Juliet, he growled, his voice a jagged rasp. You had too much. You were just an obstacle, a line item. To him, I wasn't a sister. I was a barrier to a payout. I didn't argue, I just got up. The heavy iron door clicked shut, and for the first time in 20 years, I took a full breath. Victor got 12 years. Amber had vanished, likely halfway to Vegas, before the first cuff hit Dean's wrist. Margaret escaped the cage, but not the fallout. Her lawyer argued that just do it, leave me out of it was a refusal to participate rather than an endorsement. The legal system found its loophole. It wasn't enough for a murder charge. But the court of public opinion doesn't care about loopholes. The First Baptist Church didn't wait for a verdict. They saw the transcripts projected on the courtroom screen. By the time Margaret walked out, she was a ghost. The ladies of the auxiliary, the same ones who had glared at me, now turned their backs when she walked into the grocery store. Someone spray-painted Judas on her front door in the middle of the night. She couldn't take the silence. Within a month, she sold the house and bought a one-way ticket to Florida. She was running, but the truth in Connecticut was etched in stone. The day before she left, she begged for a meeting at a diner on the edge of town. The coffee was black, cold, and tasted like burnt rubber. Margaret sat across from me, looking 20 years older. Her hair was a mess of gray. I didn't wait for the theater. I slid a no-contact order across the table. No calls, no texts, I said. My voice was as dry as a desert wind. If you come within a mile of me or try to use my name, I'll have Thomas Mercer put you in a hole so deep you'll forget what the sun looks like. Margaret touched the edge of the paper. I'm your mother, Juliet. You can't cut the cord. We're blood. I looked at the woman who had watched an 11-year-old girl walk into a storm. I looked at the woman who had greenlit a hitman. You were my mother, I said. I didn't raise my voice. You chose to stop a long time ago. Today, I'm just honoring your choice. I stood up. Margaret buried her face in her hands, a low sob escaping her throat. I didn't feel hatred. I felt nothing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $5 bill and 3 ones. I slapped them onto the glass tabletop. They hit the surface with a crisp sound. $8, I said. 5 for the coffee. 3 for the permission slip you never signed back in 2003. And the rest? The price of the 8 words you used to sell me out. We're even. I walked out and didn't look back. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. The war was over. The boundaries were set. I went back to Grandpa Walter's house that evening to start the real work. The estate was settled, but the house was full of ghosts. I started in the garage, clearing out old tires. I noticed a section of floorboards that didn't sit right. The wood was scarred, with a faint gap near the workbench. I grabbed a crowbar. I pried the board up, expecting old tools. Instead, I found a metal ammunition can wrapped in plastic. I pulled it out, my pulse thrumming. I popped the latch. Inside was a photograph of my father, a man I was told died before I was born. But on the back was a date from 3 years ago, and a phone number with a Florida area code. My hands started to shake. The war wasn't over. It was just changing fronts. I looked at the number, then at the photo. My father was alive, and Margaret was heading exactly where he was. The real extraction began. I reached for my phone, but stopped. I didn't need a lawyer. I needed a scout. Walter had known. He had always known. The box wasn't just a firing squad. It was a map. It led to the man who abandoned me. I gripped the crowbar, the steel biting into my palm. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a hunter. I moved back to the Hubbard Street house in late spring. The place was a tomb of old memories and thick dust. It was time to gut it. I needed to rip out the rot, the old wallpaper, and the smell of a life lived in shadows. I started in Walter's bedroom. The air was stagnant, smelling of cedar and stale winter. I was prying up the floorboards near the closet, the crowbar groaning against rusted nails. Then the steel hit something that didn't sound like wood. A dull, heavy thud. I cleared the dirt. There was a hidden compartment built into the floor joists. Inside sat a thick accordion file, wrapped in plastic to keep out the damp. Thomas Mercer never mentioned a secret stash. I sat on the cold floor and flicked on my tactical flashlight. I pulled out the first stack of papers. My heart did a slow roll. Petition for grandparental custody, dated December 2003. 1 month after I'd arrived with that black trash bag. It wasn't just one filing. There were 17. 17 separate, bloody attempts to take me away from Margaret. 2003, 2004, 2005. Every single year until the day he died in 2010, Commander Walter Ashford had been in family court. He had been fighting a war I never knew was happening. I read the transcripts, eyes burning. Margaret had played the system perfectly. She'd stood in her Sunday best, clutching a Bible, and painted Walter as a senile, grease-stained mechanic who couldn't raise a girl. She told the court he was unstable, a drunk. She used my silence, the silence of a terrified kid, as proof I was better off with her. 17 times a judge scribbled a denial. 17 times Walter walked out of that courthouse, drove home, and picked up a wrench. He looked me in the eye every afternoon and never let a drop of that bitterness spill. He'd fought 17 campaigns for my soul and lost everyone on paper. But he kept me fed. He kept me warm. He traded his own dignity, letting the town think he was a failure, just so I could grow up thinking I was a normal kid. He was a soldier who never retreated, even when the hill was lost. Tucked at the bottom was a yellowed sheet of paper. The handwriting was ragged. Juliet, my little bird, I failed you 17 times. I couldn't give you a name that wasn't tied to her. When you find this, take the money. Build the things I couldn't. Make a home that no one has the right to kick you out of. Not her. Stand your ground, Captain. The ice shattered. For the first time, the professional mask fell off. I didn't just cry. I broke. I sat in that dusty room and sobbed into the plastic file until my lungs felt full of jagged glass. My grandfather hadn't just given me a roof. He'd spent his last years trying to buy me a life. He was the only person who had ever truly stood guard over me. I'd spent a decade thinking I was an unloved charity case. 3 months later, the renovation was done. The house on Hubbard Street was a fortress of peace. It was a Friday afternoon, gray and leaking a cold drizzle that felt like that night in 2003. I was in the kitchen when I saw a figure through the window. Margaret. She was standing across the street, huddled under a plastic poncho. She looked shrunken. The arrogant tilt of her head was gone, replaced by the look of a stray dog. She was staring at the porch, eyes wet, searching for an opening. The 11-year-old girl in me, the one who still wanted to believe in a mother, felt a pull toward the deadbolt. But the captain took over. I didn't open the door. I walked onto the porch and stood at the top of the steps. I didn't grab a coat. I let the rain hit my face. I stood with my shoulders back and my chin up. I stood guard. I looked her in the eyes across the wet asphalt, and I shook my head. One slow, deliberate no. No more entries, no more breaches. Margaret's face crumbled. She looked down at her sodden shoes and turned. She started walking away, footsteps splashing in the puddles. This time, I wasn't the one walking into the dark. I watched until she was nothing but a smudge against the rain. I turned to go inside, but a flash of light caught my eye. A black sedan was idling at the far end of the block. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, gray-haired, and holding a military-issue coin. He didn't move. He just stared. My blood went cold. This wasn't over. The 17 campaigns were just the beginning. I reached for my phone, but stopped. I knew that man from a photo I wasn't supposed to have. I stepped off the porch, rain drenching my shirt, and walked toward him. "Dad?" I whispered. The man didn't answer. He just pointed toward the mailbox. Inside was a single black leaf bag and a note. Time to finish the job. I looked at the bag, then at the man. The rain was heavy now, washing away the last of the Hubbard Street peace. The war had gone global. The house on Hubbard Street didn't smell like damp earth or secrets anymore. It smelled like fresh white paint, pine lumber, and the lemon floor wax that the kids kept scuffing up. I stood at the end of the driveway, looking at the hand-carved wooden sign hanging over the gate. Ashford Nest. It wasn't a memorial for a dead man. It was a bridge for the living. I used the Hearthline funds to turn Grandpa Walter's legacy into a transitional home for kids who had been tossed out with the morning trash, just like I was in 2003. They didn't have to wait in the rain. They didn't have to sleep in garages. We offered them more than a bed. We gave them a perimeter. Grace was there, her combat medic bag replaced by a first aid station in the sunroom. Rachel Dunn handled the background checks and security. We weren't a family by blood, and I was fine with that. Blood is what Margaret used to justify murder. Choice is what kept us alive. I learned that family isn't the name on a birth certificate. It's the person who grabs your hand when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and doesn't let go, no matter how hard the wind blows. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't just a soldier, I was Juliet. But lowering your guard is harder than taking a hill in a sandstorm. I started therapy on Tuesday mornings in an office that smelled like lavender. I had to learn how to put the weapons down when there wasn't an enemy in the room. I had to realize that surviving isn't the same thing as being okay. You can dodge every bullet on a battlefield and still be bleeding out from a wound you can't see. The truth was a jagged pill, but I needed it. I needed to scrape away the rot that Margaret and Dean had left behind. I needed to cauterize the memories of that night on the porch. Now, I don't wake up at 3 a.m. checking the locks or waiting for a text from a burner phone. I just sleep. 1 year after the judge slammed his gavel and ended the war, I sat on the front porch with Thomas Mercer. The Connecticut afternoon was warm, the air tasting like cut grass. Thomas reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, cream-colored envelope. The wax seal was a deep, dried blood red. "Rosemary gave me this during the funeral," Thomas said, sliding it across the table. "She told me you weren't ready at 18. She said you'd need it when the dust finally settled." I picked it up. The paper felt heavy. I ran my thumb over the wax, then snapped it. The sound was crisp, like a dry twig breaking. Inside was a letter from my grandmother, Rosemary. Her handwriting was elegant, a contrast to Walter's rough scrawl. "Juliet, don't let the hate win," she wrote. "Don't let Margaret's darkness turn you into a version of her. She doesn't own your heart. Build your own nest. Fill it with people who choose you, just like you choose them. Your grandfather and I, we chose you every single day. We still do." I folded the letter and tucked it into my pocket. I looked out at the lawn where 3 boys were kicking a soccer ball around, their laughter echoing off the neighbor's siding. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue. The weight that had been sitting on my chest since I was 11 years old finally evaporated into the humid air. If you're listening right now, and you're trapped in a house where they treat you like a tool instead of a human being, listen to me. Leaving isn't a betrayal. It's a rescue mission. Setting a boundary with your own blood isn't heartless. It's being honest. You don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting your own soul. You don't have to stay in a burning building just because you know the people who lit the fire. My name is Juliet Beard. They tried to take my money. They tried to take my sanity. They even tried to take my life. But in the end, they only managed to take their own masks off. I am the one standing on the porch. I am the one holding the keys. I am the one who gets to decide who comes through that door. The war didn't break me. It just showed me what I was made of. And it turns out I'm made of more than just their mistakes. I'm made of Walter's grit, Rosemary's grace, and my own iron will. I stood up and walked toward the kids, the grass crunching under my boots. One of them kicked the ball too hard and it rolled to my feet. I trapped it, looked back at the house, and smiled. The red flag on the mailbox was down. No more warnings, just a quiet Friday. Thank you for being part of this journey, for standing with me. Keep your own perimeter secure. Protect your peace like it's the most valuable asset you own. I took a deep breath of the clean air. The door was open, the lights were on, and for the first time, I was truly home. Extraction complete. We are clear for takeoff.